we got to start with what was the big thing last night, and that was Saul Canelo Alvarez collecting another belt to his Super Middleweight Championship reign with his TKO knockout of Billy Joe Saunders. He stopped him in the 8th round. He did not answer the bell for round 9. A vicious uppercut right on his orbital bone. And he decided after that, badly swelling as the round was going on, Canelo was urging on the crowd. He was trying to get the kill. He went back to his corner. He was standing. He was like a bull ready to bust out there in the 9th round to finish off Billy Joe Saunders. And Billy Joe Saunders in his corner looked on that other side of the ring, and they decided no mas. And that was all she wrote. Canelo Alvarez adds the WBO Super Middleweight Championship to his collection of WBC, WBA, the Ring magazine, and now he has one last piece of the crown to go get when it comes to Caleb Plant. So let's dive into the fight a little bit. First of all, I'll say this right off the bat. The broadcast crew was out to lunch, mostly Chris Mannix. I mean, his scorecard was an absolute atrocity. He had, after 7 rounds, Canelo Alvarez was down 5-2 in his books. Just an awful scorecard on his part. Too much of them getting dazzled by Billy Joe Saunders, because look, the fight really did take a bit of a flip, if you could say. It took a little bit of an I shouldn't even say a flip. It took an interesting turn in about round 4. You definitely felt Billy Joe Saunders getting more comfortable, but up until that point, really was mostly just mostly just moving, and mostly was just peppering Canelo with a jab over here and there, and he wasn't really hitting him that much. I mean, for all the credit Billy Joe Saunders was getting for elusive, I kind of felt like Canelo was being just as elusive with Billy Joe. Like, nothing was getting to him that much. And then round 4, he really did settle in and did, find some more combinations. The only thing that really would bother me about giving Billy Joe Saunders that round was that Canelo landed the best punch of the round. He actually landed that uppercut on Billy Joe Saunders, really nearly sent the mouthpiece flying in that regard. So up until that point, rounds 1 through 4, he really didn't have Canelo in a level where you could say Canelo was super uncomfortable. Now, there were some things that were concerning, if you want to say, like, maybe we're going to have a problem here, because round 5 was a no doubt Billy Joe Saunders round. He was certainly letting his hands go. He was holding his hands low. He was doing a really smart thing. I think part of this was they really wanted to try and tire Canelo out, because there was a whole thing and a whole to-do made this week about the 22-foot ring. I don't even think Billy Joe, and they mentioned this on the broadcast, where they said he's never fought in a ring that big, and so I think he was even getting used to how much real estate he actually had to work with Canelo. But even with that, he is still, in some ways the naturally bigger guy, even though Canelo wears 268 very well. So he could kind of scoop in and was holding him up against the rope. So he was looking for some ways to really tire Canelo out and frustrate Canelo, have a lot of real estate for him to come forward to get those attacks on him. And so I do think that Billy Joe was doing some really, really smart stuff. It's just they weren't winning rounds for me. I think we were just getting a little bit too crazy. And this happens all the time on broadcasts. It's why people get pissed off with a lot of broadcast crew, because they fall into these narratives and they fall into these traps of something happens in a fight, or we go into a fight and there's a preconceived notion of what we think is going to happen, and then something a little bit interesting happens, or something switches momentum, or something that they never saw coming happens, and then it's like they can never get off of that track. It's a dangerous thing when people are calling fights, and especially a crew that's fairly new, that's not quite, quite frankly, isn't my favorite broadcast crew. They never have a steady play-by-play guy, because they'll go from Grisham to Bill to Brian Kenny and then back again. So they'll flip back and forth. They don't really have a steady force with it. Mannix and Moore are kind of like the 1-2 guys there. And I actually think, I think that Mannix is decent as a boxing podcast guy and a guy who can throw opinions out on boxing. But sometimes, he gets onto these broadcasts and he's just he's just in a completely different realm. I mean, he has one of the most embarrassing calls with that whole Anthony Joshua, Andy Ruiz thing. And Moore, I could take or leave. I think Moore is actually pretty decent. They had Carl Froch on the broadcast tonight. I did love seeing Roy Jones Jr. on the broadcast tonight. And honestly, DAZN, do yourself a favor, and I really, really believe this. You guys should really just go import the HBO broadcast. I mean, go get Roy Jones Jr. for the desk, for the broadcast table. Go get where the hell's Lampley? Get Jim Lampley on the line. Get him out there. He needs to be on the broadcast crew. What the hell's he been doing? Get Kellerman from ESPN, and you'll roll with that. Those are your ponies, and you have the biggest star in the sport. You want to be regarded as big time, and I just feel like this crew is just it just has so much that's left to be desired. And they're always just trying to go in 9 different places. They put Carl Froch on the broadcast tonight to add a little bit of British spice to it, I guess. Then they're going to Roy Jones off at the desk. They did this the other fight where they went to like Gareth Davies. They're just trying to do too damn much on these DAZN broadcasts. But my biggest problem, honestly, was the Chris Mannix scorecard because, at least with Carl Froch, when they went back to him, he said after, 7 rounds, he goes, I still got it, Canelo Alvarez up 4-2 or 5-2 afterwards. And you're like, all right, cool. Well, you know what? At least he sees what's happening because really what was happening is, look, Billy Joe was getting a lot more comfortable, and that was definitely the case. He was feeling himself, but the return fire that he had, like there was a moment in round 7 where, they're fawning over what Billy Joe Saunders is doing. And, he's making Canelo miss. Like, there's no doubt about that, but he's not returning any fire. And whenever he was, Canelo was just as good with his head movement and making him miss. And then he still always had this go-to move of hitting him to the body. And those were the most convincing scoring blows. And if you don't think that's the case, you're just silly. And we saw it today with what ended up happening where he catches him with that uppercut because he was putting all of that work into the body. And then that eventually is he has to duck down because he's worried about another body shot. Bang. Oh, sorry. I was going with a monster uppercut. Sorry, Billy Joe Saunders. Now your eye is shut. So, yeah, I just thought that, they were kind of missing the boat, but mostly their blow-by-blow guy, Grisham and Mannix, whose, scorecard was just delusionally bad. And the scorecards ended up dictating. I think there were 2 of them at 78-74. That's exactly what I had after 8 rounds when it was actually stopped. Then I think one at 77-75, which that's completely accepted. If you maybe thought, hey, you were really dazzled. You thought first round, they said was kind of close. I thought Canelo landed, even in a feel-out round, was still landing, the body shots that mattered. And then, if you were dazzled enough by what he was doing with his movement in round 7, like those are the 2 swings for me. I didn't even bother looking at what the scorecards are because who cares? The fight was stopped. As far as Billy Joe's concerned, he's going to get a lot of people were like, oh, how could he stop on the stool? How could he not go forth? First of all, couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Billy Joe Saunders, what a peach. You can just go look up what Billy Joe Saunders has in his past. So not exactly rooting for the dude to go beat Canelo Alvarez, if I could just be frank with you. But I thought, listen, I told you guys last week when we went into this thing, I was like, yeah, he's got some things I'd be worried about. I still thought Canelo was going to win. And I do think that Canelo showed some growth of handling an elusive fighter. He really hasn't had to deal with that, especially the frustration of just not landing every big shot at will, where he's been able to just basically break people down. So you definitely saw growth there. I don't think that Billy Joe's even as elusive or as difficult as an Aries Landy Lara or even a prime Austin Trout. Certainly not a Floyd Mayweather. That'd be a ridiculous thing to say. And those guys a lot faster. But Canelo, this is a different weight class. I keep saying this with Canelo and this obsession with, the thing with him and Floyd and him saying, oh, I could have beaten a prime Floyd. It's like, no, you couldn't. Floyd made that point this week at Hard Rock Stadium. He goes, I wasn't even in my prime when I beat Canelo. Canelo was in his prime. And maybe you could say, oh, he was in his early prime. I think the thing that Canelo wasn't probably in was in his prime weight class, which I think we're seeing. I think this 168. He is just slick enough for 168 where a lot of these big boys can't touch him, and yet he's strong enough where he hurts everybody. It really just feels like he's at this just optimum weight here. And maybe he can go up to light heavyweight after, not to make it seem inevitable, but after he collects the 4th belt at 168, maybe he ends up going and having another run at 175 and trying to collect stuff there. But he just seems so perfect for this weight class out of any of the ones that he's been at. Even middleweight. I just think that he's carried up a little bit more muscle, a little bit more power. He seems as confident as ever. But yeah, getting back to Billy Joe Saunders and losing the fight, Billy Joe Saunders having a closed eye and having a swelled shut eye. You saw how uncomfortable he was in just holding on to those final minutes or seconds of that round where his eye was swelling shut. It was so obviously a cracked orbital bone. I don't know if the MRI or the X-rays have come back, but like when something swells like that quickly, like that's some serious damage. You could hear it through the television when it happened. And for a guy like Billy Joe Saunders, who is a distance fighter, elusive, defensive, he has to see where everything's coming. That's his bread and butter. He'd be better off breaking his right hand than he would breaking his eye. Because at least if he had a broken hand, he'd still be able to still stick his jab and maybe wince one out every now and then. But if he can't see against Canelo Alvarez, I mean, what are we doing here? Like it legitimately is a pointless fight, especially a fight that his corner probably thinks he is losing. Now, he wasn't at a blowout distance. I mean, he was down 3 rounds on 2 scorecards and he was down 2 on another. So it's still a winnable fight on points. But how does a guy who is getting around this by, making Canelo Alvarez miss and countering shots, how do you do that if you can't see half the punches that are coming? So I don't blame him for taking an injury like that and not gutting it through. If it was a different fighter, yeah, I could maybe see the argument. If this was Gennady Golovkin and they're going to stand toe-to-toe and he can just feel it out and just go super, super tough, bang for bang, because they're going to be fighting in a phone booth. Hey, I'd hear that out a little bit more. But with Billy Joe Saunders, what's he going to do? You think he's going to just change his style and all of a sudden they're going to be playing Rock'em Sock'em Robots? No, sir. That's not happening. So I don't blame him for not continuing. I know that people get crazy with that. I saw some fighters who were like, I would continue to go on. It's like, all right, bro. Like, you're not there in that moment. Like, okay, he's going to go out there I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. If he goes out there for another round with one eye against Canelo Alvarez, he's going to be staring with his one good eye at the lights. That's what's going to happen. So Canelo Alvarez gets his 3rd piece of the Super Middleweight Championship. All that's left to do is get Caleb Plant. There have been talks of the difficulties of this, that, it's PBC. Canelo is a free agent. He's kind of done his thing with DAZN, so he can go and make this happen. There's been talks that maybe this is going to be on Showtime Boxing, or Showtime Pay-Per-View, excuse me. So, look, I mean, if you're Caleb Plant, we've had Caleb Plant on the show. This is what he wants, bar none. Like, this is what he's talked about that he wants. He wants the shot at Canelo Alvarez. You're given the Willy Wonka golden ticket. You got to take it if you're him. And look, I like Caleb Plant as a fighter. I'm a fan. I like the guy. I think he's a talented fighter. I think he can bring back a little bit more firepower than Billy Joe Saunders certainly can. I don't think he's quite as good defensively as Billy Joe Saunders is, even though I do think that he is slick and I do think that he has boxing skill. I just wouldn't put it quite at the level. But I think what he is, where if you put Billy Joe and that stuff at like an 8, maybe Caleb's like at a 7, and then whatever if you put Billy Joe at like a 4, maybe you put like the offense at a 7. Like, I think he's a little bit more well-rounded of a fighter. And quite frankly, like, I don't know how much this idea of you're going to go out point Canelo Alvarez at this weight class, I don't know how many guys are going to do that. I think that you gotta bring some dog out of him. I think that you got to you got to wear on him a little. I think that you almost got to bring the fight to him a little bit, it seems like, because these guys who are kind of just letting Canelo get off and get comfortable and setting up all that stuff, you're only going to get him more in his wheelhouse as the fight goes on. He's a very, very smart fighter. He's only getting smarter. I think that, the guy that we've seen up at this weight class who's had the most success has been Triple G, and Triple G's a beast. He's going to try and bring that. Now, I know that's not quite what Caleb Plant brings to the table. I'm just saying that I hope that Caleb Plant isn't going at this with, hey, I'm going to stick and move and be on my bicycle, and I'm just going to do it better than Billy Joe Saunders did. Nah. Like, Billy Joe Saunders did fine. He got a couple of rounds, maybe 3, if you were being generous, in my opinion. That's not good enough to beat a guy who's the number 1 pound for pound guy in the world right now, which, by the way, he is. He is the number 1 pound for pound guy in the world right now. It's not to say that I don't think Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence or some of those guys aren't capable of being that. But Canelo Alvarez has been the most active guy and has taken on a lot of the best competition that's been available to him. Yieldi Avdiram aside, which, by the way, we found out he fought basically training for a week and fresh off of COVID, fresh off that Rona, and beat him a couple rounds. But we all know that was a make-good showcase fight anyway. Like, it was literally, I don't even think you want to call it a tune-up fight. It was like a stay tuned in fight, I guess. I don't know what the hell the term would be for it. So, but in my mind, like, look, I think that this stuff matters. I think that your activity matters, the fights you take matter, the stakes that you fight matter. And these welterweights, man, they're just not fighting on heavy stakes right now. They're not. And they're just not being very active. I think Errol's last fight against Danny was fine. But it's not the fight people want to see. And like, with this, you just got to look at it from the standpoint of when those guys finally decide to step into the ring and fight each other, then we can put them back in the conversation of, hey, whoever wins this fight is the number 1 pound for pound guy, Spence or Crawford. But I don't think that they deserve to be in that conversation right now just because they can't come to this agreement. It's not like I want to outcast them from the top 5 or anything like that. It's just I think that's a fair thing right now. So, anyway, great performance from Canelo Alvarez yesterday in the win over Billy Joe Saunders.